Morning, everybody. Happy, Mondays, and welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the nation's biggest party pooper and the Mirror's political editor and scoopmeister, Pippa Crerar. Morning, Pippa.
Good morning. I'm sorry, Susie. I do apologise for...
You're never being invited to a Christmas party ever again when this is all over. Now, this is the People's Paper Review. So get into the comments, ask us your questions. We can't answer them all. We do answer the best ones. The best ones get a News Agenda mug. Woohoo! On which note, Francis from last Monday, I'm still trying to contact you to give you your mug. If you're watching, reply to your message requests and you can give me your address and we'll get you a mug. So what have we got today? Well, good Lord and blimey is pretty much sums it up. The Mirror has splashed on the PM's massive ramping up of the booster programme, along with calls for the police to investigate the PM and his office for breaking their own COVID rules. Now, Pippa's story of 2 weeks ago, it feels like 2 years, that there were a couple of rule-breaking Christmas parties in Downing Street last year has snowballed into a scandal that threatens to bring down the PM. We now know of 10 parties held in and around Whitehall, including some with loud music and booze in offices just feet away from where the PM was working and in his own flat, which he says he didn't know anything about, and were, in any event, within the rules, if they happened, which they didn't. Yesterday, the Sunday Mirror splashed on a picture of the PM taking part in a Christmas quiz on a Zoom call, with sources saying he was watching up to 24 people at a time socialising on his screen. And now, for what feels like the umpteenth time, MPs are calling on the police to investigate, and the Met saying it won't because actual photographic evidence still isn't enough evidence. Now, Pippa, there's plenty over the weekend, and no doubt some watching this who'll say, this is just a Zoom thing. It's not an in-person party. These are people who work together all day anyway. What's the harm? So take us through it. What rules are your sources saying were broken, and were they broken or were they just fractured a bit?
Well, there's several elements to this, Susie. And first of all is the fact that the Zoom quiz took place at all. It was supposed to be a virtual quiz. Staff had been invited to it a couple of weeks beforehand. And when they got to that afternoon, many of them decided that actually it'd be more fun to stay in the building. Lots of them popped down to the local Tesco Metro, got some bottles of Prosecco and wine and beer and brought them back to the office. And my sources tell me that more than 70 of those that took part in the quiz, the virtual quiz, did from the office rather than on their own at home, which is what the original intention had been. So that is the first potential breach, because the minute work stops and the fun begins, then the excuse or the exemption for working goes. And while it is absolutely right, and Nadine Zahawi was absolutely right yesterday to say that these are people that have been working in incredibly stressful situations and that they've been working incredibly hard, it's not the case to say that they had to be in the office that evening for work. And one source told me that no work was done at all by all those people. So that would be a breach of the rule at the time in Tier 2, which was that no more than two people should gather inside for a social for any social event from different households. The second aspect of this is, of course, that the Prime Minister, whose picture we see on that screen, will have been looking the other way, will have been seeing groups of people. And now those 70 people weren't all sitting in one room. They were all divided into teams of 6, and the Prime Minister's own private office, the policy unit, the events team, the press office were all among those taking part. And he would have known that there was at least 6 people per team per room. And in some cases, I'm told that there was as many as 4 teams in one room, which so he would have been quite clear that those rules were being breached, that it wasn't just people sitting at home and dialing in. And the third, and potentially the most serious allegation, is about the Prime Minister himself. Because what we've had so far with the stories we've revealed are allegations that senior officials and political aides and so on gathered. We had a couple of stories with Gavin Williamson, the former Education Secretary, and Therese Coffey, the Work and Pension Secretary, who allegedly took part in social events in their departments. And one of our first stories about a leaving do in Number 10 suggested that the Prime Minister came and gave a speech, and my sources are adamant that that is the case. It would have been in breach of lockdown rules at the time. But this appears to be evidence that the Prime Minister himself broke the rule of mixing with another, or in fact, in this case, 2 other households for a social event. That is not, as some ministers have told us, his office. The PM works in the PM study. That's the Thatcher room, as is quite evident from the picture behind him on the wall. It's quite clear that it was not work, because you can see that we cropped the image in order to help protect one source. But what we could see is that is a screen, and you can just about pick out that the one official on one side has tinsel around him, and the other is wearing a Santa hat. And we are aware that we're confident that the conversation was not about work, that it was about the quiz and answering, and the Prime Minister reading out his round. So that is the mysterious allegation: the Prime Minister himself breaching coronavirus rules at the time that he imposed on everybody else across the rest of the country, aware of his staff breaching them and the breach by staff themselves. So that's the questions that the Prime Minister is facing on this morning.
Okay, now Daniel says, Pippa, do you ever worry about your scoops? And do you get any backlash from MPs? Have you had any backlash since all this?
No, and I have to say, Daniel, I'm not sure whether you remember, but last year I broke the Dominic Cummings story. Dominic Cummings was at the time the most senior advisor in government to the Prime Minister, and it was the first really of these sorts of stories of major breaches by senior figures. There'd been a couple of others for scientists and other ministers, but Dominic Cummings was an extremely powerful figure. And having gone through that experience and experienced the sort of the lines that government comes out with when it doesn't really want to deny things but doesn't want to confirm them either, and some of the fallout from that, I felt much more emboldened this time round. And I know how it works a lot more, so I felt much more confident. And in terms of blowback from MPs, well, I've had a lot of private messages from people acknowledging that, on the Conservative side, I should say, acknowledging that it's a good story and that questions definitely need to be asked, and the Prime Minister's in a difficult position. Nobody, I not for a minute would expect any sort of fallout in terms of Number 10. I mean, they know that we are not a friendly newspaper anyway, that we will challenge them and hold them to account. But that aside, we have professional relationships with them. I do my best to be entirely professional with them and they with me, and I expect that to continue.
Excellent. There you go, Daniel. That's answered your question. Now, one thing that people keep asking, Pippa, you may have heard this already, and it comes up a lot, is this all stuff was happening last Christmas. But as your sources have shown, they were taking pictures of it and perhaps video or records or something else. Did they at the time, your sources have said, the ones who've been quoted have said, we didn't really realise how bad it was, and we understand now, and perhaps that's why they're coming forward to you. But did they at the time realise that this was not cricket? Was that why they were taking these pictures? And why are they coming forward now?
I think there's two reasons why they're coming forward. One, I think, is because you're right, they didn't necessarily recognise the scale of the upset over these parties. And what I think, I remember publishing that first story a couple of weeks ago and thinking, well, this is going to be like a 24-hour wonder, that everyone will be, angry about it for 24 hours and then it'll blow over, because it's a year ago, and it's a very different sort of scenario now with the COVID boosters, the COVID vaccines rather, and so on. But I think I'd underestimated, and others clearly underestimated, because I'd certainly lots of people in Westminster saying to me, it's a bit Westminster bubbly, isn't it? And I don't see where it goes. People saying to me, not dismissing it outright, but I think we all underestimated that actually the scars that people still bear from this time last year, and whether that's just, not being able to go and spend Christmas with their parents or their children, or whether that's much more substantial, not being able to see relatives in care homes, or indeed relatives as they were dying, sometimes of COVID, over Christmas. And I think it's reopened a lot of those scars. And I think that has partly happened because we're once again in a scenario where the next few weeks look very uncertain because of the Omicron variant. And we have some new restrictions coming in. We're being told to work from home, or asked to work from home from today. And it's very much the forefront of people's minds that, they're cancelling their own Christmas parties, even though they don't have to. Lots of people, including the Mirror party, was cancelled, and sort of making wise decisions so that they don't end up infecting loved ones, perhaps more vulnerable loved ones, over Christmas. But everyone's very conscious that there may be more to come, depending on how the scientists determine how impactful Omicron is. So that sort of salience, I think, we captured with these stories, and that's why they became much more sort of powerful than they were. So a combination of that, plus the Prime Minister's reaction, the Number 10's reaction to them. And I'm very conscious that people I've spoken to since the first story, some insiders, if you want to call them that, are astonished at the handling by the government, the denial that a party on the 18th of December had taken place, then sort of suggesting, well, something may have taken place, but it was within the rules, but we're still not going to confirm a party took place. And then Simon Case being asked to look at one, and then another, and then another, and then presumably this morning they'll also be asked to look at the festive quiz as well. I think a lot of people within government think that it's been a complete shambles, the government's handling of this, and it's actually very damaging for the Prime Minister to have come out and what looks like misled people about what he knew about parties. And he, like I say, he's going to have some answers, some questions to answer this morning when he comes in front of the TV cameras.
Yeah, now keep asking us your questions. What do you think Boris Johnson should be asked and questioned about? Are you bothered about the Zoom quiz? Are you bothered about what he may have seen on his screen? Michael says, how can the CCTV system in Whitehall catch Matt Hancock cheating on his wife, but the police can't look into it to see who was at these parties? Now, yesterday, The Sun was reporting the PM was in a restaurant past curfew and had to be spoken to by staff for mixing between tables and not wearing a mask. We know he doesn't want to wear a mask even in hospitals. And we know he's not one for the rules. And the vast majority of his backbenchers don't like too many rules either. But the police keep saying, Pippa, there's not enough evidence. It would appear we've got actual photographic evidence here of at least a technical breach in the rules by the Prime Minister himself, with those three people on the Zoom call. How long can the Met Police keep saying they're not going to investigate this?
So Scotland Yard have had a general policy throughout coronavirus of not investigating retrospectively COVID breaches which took place unless there was an officer present. So, for example, a neighbour called up and said, my next door neighbour's having a party with 50 people. A police officer turned up. They were there. They saw it with their own eyes. They presumably had some sort of body camera that captured it. And then a year later, those cases are now coming to court. So there's some which look like they're retrospective, but because it was a police officer there. Now, there wasn't any police officers here. And a lot of people have asked me about this on social media. Surely Number 10 is surrounded by police officers. But the fact is that the vast majority of people at all these gatherings worked in the building, or at least had a work excuse to be in the building. So they might have been officials from the other departments, Tory party officials, that sort of thing. So, and Number 10 is incredibly secure. But if you're a pass holder and you work in the building, then the police at the door don't know whether you are leaving late at 11 o'clock at night because you've been dealing on a national emergency, or whether because you've been doing a festive quiz or having a drink or two with your mates and colleagues. They may have had their suspicions if people piled out as Santa hats, but I don't know whether they were unwise enough to do that. So they have this Scotland Yard have this retrospective policy, and then they also have said consistently throughout that they need evidence. Now, we published an image, a couple of images, I think, from the festive quiz. Dominic Cummings says that there are other images out there of other events held in Number 10. That's my understanding too. We'll have to see in coming days whether any of those emerge.
Have the police contacted you, Pippa, to ask for any of your evidence, as happens quite a lot when journalists expose wrongdoing?
They haven't, but we are at, what time are we, Susie? 9:30 on a Monday morning. So you know, I'll keep you posted if there's a knock at the door.
Yeah, well, you know where Pippa is, officer, if you need her. Now, Mike says those 3 people in the room itself is a breach of COVID laws. It's a scandal that Cressida Dick refuses to investigate when actual proof of wrongdoing is found. What's the point of the Met? Cressida Dick's probably waiting for her peerage, I would have thought, is perhaps what's going on there. Now, William says, strange how the media comes out with all this now. Why not a year ago? We've answered that question, William, pretty much, because they've started to realise how bad it is now, unfortunately. And it's not like, can you just confirm you haven't been sitting on this amazing story for a whole year? You actually published it when you got it.
That is the case. I did, however, Susie, hear rumours about this in January and tried my best to look into it, but they were secondhand and unsubstantiated. And we have a very high bar of proof to run a story, not just as a legal requirement, but also because of sort of, journalistically, ethically, I and the Mirror have high standards on stories like these. So the story didn't go anywhere at that point. That's not to say I didn't keep trying, but it was only really, like you say, when we got sort of closer to Christmas again and people realised that they maybe shouldn't have been behaving in the way that they had, that they decided to start talking.
Yeah. Now, worth bearing in mind when government ministers come out and say, oh, well, it's just anonymous sources and who cares, but it's just in a newspaper. It's not proved or established or proof or anything else. As Pippa says, by the time it's got into a newspaper and into print, it's passed an awful lot of hurdles and a lot of eyes to get to that point. All right. Newspapers all have to have legal insurance and lawyers and everything else. So if once it's in the papers, it's pretty tight normally. Now, at the same time all this is going on, the polls are hammering the PM. He's got a backbench rebellion and is relying on Labour to help him govern on Tuesday when he tries to get through a vote on new COVID rules. He's got to face questions from Keir Starmer, a former director of public prosecutions, on Wednesday, and on Thursday it's the North Shropshire by-election, which the Mirror is reporting is looking decidedly shaky. If last week was crime week, then this week looks a bit like punishment week. So last night, former Minister Tobias Ellwood told Times Radio that Boris was the PM to get Brexit done, but what's needed now is a wartime Prime Minister to deal with our current crisis. Let's put aside for the fact they've had as a leader someone they know is no good in a crisis, which you'd have thought was pretty good to have anyway. And the fact it sounds a bit like Al Pacino in The Godfather. What are we hearing, Pippa, about the chances of a leadership contest? Because there's lots of rumblings, but nothing really concrete yet.
Yeah, so we're hearing rumblings about individual MPs putting their letters in to the chairman of the 1922, the Tory backbench committee. And when they reach a certain threshold, they can have a leadership contest. Now, that threshold is now, off the top of my head, I want to say 47, but I might have got that wrong, but it's in that region. And the suggestion is that we've had maybe half a dozen letters in at the moment. But the reality is only those MPs and the chairman of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady, are aware of how many there are. And in febrile times, we've got used to people sort of speculating about these sorts of things. It happened all the time with Theresa May. And then, of course, she did have no confidence votes and then eventually, obviously, the leadership contest for a successor. So it's difficult to tell. I mean, everyone at Westminster seems to feel that this is Boris Johnson's worst period yet. However, it's mid-term, and so he's got a couple of years until the electorate at large, beyond by-elections, get to have their say on him. And I think what it comes down to is whether Tory MPs feel that Boris Johnson is an electoral asset or an electoral liability. It is only 2 years ago yesterday that he won a thumping majority in the House of Commons in the 2019 general election, and he was unassailable. And it just seems astonishing to me that we're at this point now with Labour up to 11 points ahead in the polls just in the last couple of weeks. And the Prime Minister under pressure on so many fronts, not just, it has to be said, on the Christmas parties, not just on the coronavirus response, but also on everything from social care to tax to infrastructure investment. And as Tory MPs start to hear more and more from their constituents, they're on the ground. They will be home over Christmas. They'll be sort of picking up the temperature, if you like, in their constituencies about how people are feeling about the Prime Minister. That is, I think, the danger point for the Prime Minister. Because if they hear that Boris Johnson has gone from being what they regard as an electoral asset to an electoral liability, then they will be much more willing to think, maybe not actually do yet, but to think about putting those letters in. And Boris Johnson is therefore in much more difficulty. He doesn't have a natural constituency of support on the Tory backbenchers. He was always a loner when he was a backbencher. He doesn't have a big gang of people that will come out and support him.
No, he's not very popular in the parliamentary party, is he? Now, Daniel says, we've seen Theresa May speak out against Boris's cabinet. Do you think she'll speak out now? Would it make any difference if she did, Daniel? She's not widely respected, really, in the country or in government, so I don't think it would make much difference. I think she's going with the flow at the moment, but we'll see. Joanne says, one rule for them, it's another for us. Keep asking us your questions. What do you think about the Prime Minister's Zoom quiz? What do you think about how the government has handled this? Now, yesterday, the Prime Minister announced a huge ramping up of the booster programme to 1 million vaccinations a day, a target we've never managed before now, in order to stem the expected tidal wave of Omicron cases. And this morning, the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, said even if Omicron is half as deadly as Delta was, the fact it's so much more transmissible and 2 jabs do not give enough protection against it means the NHS would swiftly be overwhelmed if we don't get our boosters. We might be looking at around 75,000 deaths, according to some estimates. And that's a good scenario, right? That's half of all the people who've died so far, again. Now, Pippa, considering how slow the booster programme was to get started, I've been trying for mine for a couple of months. I finally got it on Saturday, and my arm's a bit achy, but otherwise we're okay. Are we going to hit this target of 1 million a day, do you think? Are we going to be able to avert this wave just with the boosters, or are we going to need stronger measures such as a lockdown?
So on the boosters, you're absolutely right, Susie, to say that it hasn't been as much of a triumph as the initial vaccine rollout, and the particular groups, and obviously some people that haven't even had their first jab, but been very slow uptake between 12 and 17-year-olds. And as we know, schools are like sort of hothouses for spread of infection. And there are other groups as well where uptake has been low. So people inside government this morning are saying, yes, it's our target of 1 million a week, but really it's more of an ambition. And we need to have a target in order to be able to drive the massive weight, the forces of the NHS and Whitehall to sort of into action. And as we know, the army's being brought in. They'll have retired GPs brought back. They're opening up some smaller vaccine centres across the country. I mean, I have my doubts. I really, really hope that they reach 1 million, but I doubt that they will do that anytime soon. But I suspect we will see a big ramping up. I mean, there's lots of people like me, and you, Susie, who weren't invited by the NHS. I'm 45 and didn't receive an invitation, and then popped down to King's College Hospital, my local hospital, yesterday at 5 o'clock, and there wasn't a queue, and walked in and got one. I suspect that there will be lots, much longer queues today now that it's been announced and it's been rolled out to younger age groups. But and obviously every extra booster is going to help, but it's not on its own probably going to be enough. Still lots of uncertainty around Omicron and how serious it's going to be. But we do know that it spreads very fast. And even if you take a small proportion of a large number of people ending up in hospital, then that could potentially overwhelm the NHS, which is the big problem. And the challenge the Prime Minister faces now is that if he knows that restrictions are going to be needed, is it better to put them in earlier or later? And we all know that he's particularly sensitive about Christmas and allowing families to spend time together. So my feeling is that he will politically not want to introduce restrictions before Christmas. He'll do it after, not necessarily full lockdowns, I should add, just some more restrictions in their sort of the suite of measures that they can use. But by then, of course, it might be too late. Exactly.
And it has been too late in previous waves. Now, Paul says, can we talk about the new Nationality and Borders Bill? Read the room, Paul. We're doing something else that's been passed and the shocking things it allows the government to do. This is a horrible bit of legislation, Pippa, which allows the government to deport up to anyone of sort of 5 million people who incidentally, we had the right to deport anyway if we took against them, but this time without warning them in advance. And it also creates 2 tiers of asylum seekers. So if you arrive through irregular means, that you are not able to have the same kind of treatment as if you arrive through formal means. So, if you come on a boat, you're going to have more trouble, which of course is against the UN 1951 Convention on the Rights of the Refugee and not what Churchill signed us up for after the war. We are talking about boosters and other stuff today, but there's so much other stuff going on in Parliament, which in ordinary terms, this would be a huge issue right now. And it's kind of filtering away, isn't it, a bit in the news? There just isn't the bandwidth to cover everything that the government's doing.
Yeah, and this was something obviously that passed through Parliament last week, and you're absolutely right. We covered it, but not in any way as sort of probably as much detail or prominence. I say we, the media, not just the Mirror, as we would have done otherwise. Of course, we've covered it when they first proposed it as well. This is not something that has been, it is a surprise. We knew it was coming. It does feel a bit like it's, we're going to get a few years down the line, and we're going to look back at this moment and be going over how we allowed the government to introduce a hostile environment Mark II. And I think that it does sort of, I think, throw quite a lot of doubt on claims from within the Home Office that they've learned their lessons. Obviously, a very different set of circumstances. That was about immigrants to the UK who were here legally but didn't have proof of that, and they came as children, or at a time when they didn't possibly have the paperwork. And they're then being at threat, or their offspring being at threat of being deported. But it's similar in its approach, in that it is sort of a very aggressive approach to the borders. And it's one of the big problems the government faces, because when they were elected in 2019, it was partly about getting Brexit done, it was partly about levelling up, and it was partly about toughening our borders. And certainly every expert that I speak to, beyond sort of those that possibly have a political axe to grind, but the people that really know what's going on, whether it's officials in the Home Office or the Border Force, or indeed academics or people that work for some of the refugee groups, feel that the responses that are being put on the table now are not going to deal with the problem of people putting themselves into great danger by crossing the Channel. That ultimately the answer to that is to have better legal routes to the UK, and that doesn't just mean having, important though it is, having people from Afghanistan, and that's it. There has to be sort of more options across the region from within camps and so on, so that people don't feel they need to make this perilous journey.
Yeah, the best way, of course, of not making sure no one from somewhere like Afghanistan wants to come here is making this place worse than Afghanistan. And that's not something anybody really wants to do, despite lots of talk about pull factors and so on. Now, Mike says, if the new variant's so contagious, why didn't the government do more to stop the spread earlier, for instance, by putting mitigating factors into schools? We've known about this, Pippa, and Omicron, although it's taken a while for people to get to hospital and so on and so forth, we've known about its mutations. We've known the scientists are warning about it. We knew for a fortnight before Plan B was begun that SAGE were demanding Plan B because they could see what was coming down the tracks. I want to say, why did the government not do that, and why didn't they listen to them? But I think we know why. It's because they're a bit stupid. Why didn't the government do something about it?
Well, there was a lot of, as you rightly say, over the summer, there was a lot of pressure not to ever end the wearing of face masks in quite the way that we did in England. Of course, in Scotland, they did keep them. And, some critics of them say, well, that doesn't seem to have made any difference. But I think the reality is that face masks have to be part of a suite of measures, and that there are certain things that we could have done over the autumn, not necessarily preventing us from enjoying seeing family and friends and going to work and travelling, but that might have maybe, managed to sort of slow down any spread of any new variant when it arrived, because we're kind of starting from ground zero in England. We're kind of at a point when there's no restrictions, and then suddenly we're having to catch up, and that's all very controversial and obviously highly disliked by the Libertarian wing of the Prime Minister's party, as was likely to see in this vote tomorrow. The tipping point between when the government is willing to take action politically and when it needs to be taken is scientifically is a very difficult one, and I wouldn't fancy having to make that judgment myself. I'm sure it's one of the hardest decisions the government has to make, but it does increasingly feel like it may have been wiser for us to do things like carry on with making it legal, compulsory to wear face masks on public transport, You, like me, Susie, will have loads of people at your kids' schools, friends, family getting knocked over by this new variant. And, you do wonder whether maybe it was slowed the spread just enough to be able to get more people boosted and to learn more about Omicron if we hadn't lifted every single one of the restrictions initially. That's not the same as saying we want to turn a lockdown. It's very, very far away from that.
Yeah. Now, Pamela says, how responsible is the media for the confusion on Omicron? On one hand, there's hysteria about this variant, and on others, pushing this harmless message. Pamela, the media can only really report what people tell us. And the job of a journalist is to edit and analyse that and to tell you the bit that can be verified. So what can be verified is that there are not a lot of deaths registered to Omicron in Southern Africa. However, Southern Africa doesn't register a lot of deaths, full stop. Sometimes lots of people do tend to die in ways that the authorities don't know about, and the data isn't that reliable. But we have been able to report what our scientists say, which is that it doesn't look good. And there are more than 50 mutations in this variant compared to 10 for Delta and 6 for Beta, which means it's more likely to get around our vaccines. The first real world data is that the two vaccines, especially AstraZeneca, just don't work against Omicron. Because it's so transmissible, that means it's spreading exponentially. We're all going to be facing some Omicron by the new year, and we need to have the booster, is the message. So we're trying to be as responsible as we can, but it's difficult, isn't it, Pippa? Because if you hear two different things from two different people, you kind of have to present it to the public and say, well, this is what we're being told.
Yeah, and the reality with Omicron especially is that we still don't know very much about it. But also, Susie, I think both things can be true at once. That Omicron is both incredibly fast spreading, but if you get it, isn't necessarily going to be as serious for you as if you'd had Delta or Alpha variants. The issue is that if a less serious version of a disease is transmitted across a much wider proportion of the population, then the numbers that get it and get it seriously, still as a proportion of those that get it overall is going to be small, but in numerical terms, it's actually going to be very large. And that's the problem with this one. And that's before you get to what Susie was talking about the further mutations and also the vaccine, the evading the vaccine. So there's still so many uncertainties, and all we can try and do is present the facts, and we'll continue to do that. I know that it's a very scary time for a lot of people, but we're doing our best in the paper and online. We do a huge number of explainers and Q&As, and often they have the most up-to-date, or they do have the most up-to-date information. So, please do use us as a resource for that.
Yes, and bear in mind as well, what we know about this pandemic and this virus and this variant at the moment is the most we've ever known about any virus in human history, and people are still learning about it, and you're getting that information in almost real time from the scientists. So as confusing as it may be at times, it is the most information, the best information any humans have ever had. So lap it up if I were you. Now, you'd think that there are this is all a bit grim, but there is some good news going on, and here it is. So we've got new variants, waves of death, anti-vaxxers, gloomy weather, the actual possible collapse of government, the rule of law. And you can be forgiven for feeling a bit depressed just at the moment, but there is a solution. Scientists say that listening to poetry makes you happy. In particular, they studied people listening to a reading of Yorkshire poet Ben Taylor's poetry, and his topics include Remembrance Day, Yorkshire tea, and rugby league, and found a 41% increase in the activity of the muscles that make you smile. These ones here, 41% more likely to smile away. So, Pippa, does this mean that we should all be a bit more Jane Austen and attend poetry readings? Or would this still work if we got a Yorkshireman to read your scoops out to us?
I think it's probably partly the accent, but also the subject matter. I don't think Philip Larkin is necessarily the cheeriest, despite the fact that obviously if he'd read his own poetry, it would be in an East Yorkshire accent. But I'm a big fan of accented poetry. I was just looking through earlier. I've got my forgive me for this. It's not Yorkshire. I've got my Rabbie Burns book out. Wondered whether I could read you a very famous, just a very short verse of
Go for it.
Haggis. We're not yet at Burns Night, but I'm looking forward to Burns Night and hopefully being able to be with my friends if we get to on top of this virus. So, Ode to a Haggis by Rabbie Burns. Fair fa your honest sonsy face, great chieftain o' the puddin race, aboon them attack your place. Page, tripe or therm. We'll argue word your grace as lambs may erm. You can read the rest of it in Burns books.
When we put that on YouTube, we'll have a little translation on the bottom so people know what you were saying. But chiefly the pudding race, I got that bit. I'm definitely smiling, so that's worked for me. Thank you, Pippa. Now, we've got a few questions to wrap up at the end. But very quickly, on that last question we had, I think it was Pamela who said the confusion about Omicron being supposedly harmless, but yet we have to have the boosters. As Sajid said this morning, if it's only half as deadly as Delta, we've still got perhaps 75,000 dead, because, as Pippa was saying, small proportion, but huge numbers of people, because there's about 5 million unvaxxed, including children. And there were 2 teenagers died very sadly over the weekend from the same school. And then there's long COVID. So there are more than one issue. It's just not just about old people, and it's not just about deaths. Rachel says, how can they expect us to abide by the rules when the powers that be have broken their own rules? I didn't get to say goodbye to my uncle who was in hospital and died just after Christmas. Sorry to hear that, Rachel. If I had known this party had happened, I would have gone. He died alone with a stranger next to him. I couldn't even FaceTime, as they had no iPads available. This is why, as you were saying, Pippa, people are so angry. There is visceral fury, because 150,000 dead means 500,000 grieving at least. And it means millions more aware of someone who didn't have their friends and loved ones by them when they passed away. It matters to a huge proportion of the public, doesn't it?
It really does. And, you don't need to have lost someone from COVID to feel actually the full horror of it. And Rachel, I'm so sorry for your uncle's loss. There's also, of course, as you say, Susie, people who suffer from long COVID, which can last for months and can be incredibly damaging, and still uncertain about sort of longer term impact of that, particularly on children, which is obviously very worrying. And, that people can get quite severely ill without dying, and also can be quite severely ill at home without ending up in hospital. So the numbers that have been affected by this, millions of people in the UK have caught coronavirus, and sadly, some of them have died. And sadly, it looks like we're going to see more hospitalizations and deaths in coming weeks and months. But I think really, if we can try and sort of recreate that collective spirit, regardless of what was going on at number 10 and what the Prime Minister was doing or may have been doing in terms of breaching rules, it's so important that everybody else sticks to them. And I know I will be, and I hope that everyone else will also be playing their part.
Yes. Thank you for your questions, everybody. Thank you for joining us, Pippa, and explaining some of that to people. I hope you get your Burns night, and of course it would be legal this year if you did. So let's see if that can happen. Go and read some poetry, everybody, because it's probably the only thing that's going to make you feel happy today. I wouldn't keep watching the news, because it'll only get you depressed. Join us again on Wednesday for another edition of the News Agenda. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.